Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be given this opportunity to present to you a topic with my colleagues here on climate change education for the future. My name is Shepherd Urenje, and I come from the Swedish International Center of Education for Sustainable Development. It is located at Uppsala University in Sweden. I am going to introduce this topic, and then my colleagues will give you the rest on what we have planned. I will begin my talk by giving you a brief background. I would like to introduce James Hansen. Most of you know him now. He is the director of the Institute for Space Studies and professor of Earth and Environmental Science at Columbia University. James Hansen provided what's considered the first warning about global warming when in 1988 he told a United States congressional hearing he could declare with 99% confidence that a recent sharp rise in the temperatures was a result of human activity. 32 years on, today, the world is failing miserably to address this challenge of climate change. According to James Hansen, the real hoax is by our leaders who claim to be taking action when they are not doing anything about it. I have done a quick scan of what the top challenges that are facing the world today could be. And on our left hand side, I have got information from the United Nations Foundation. I have got 5 lists here of the top pressing issues in the world: climate change, pollution, violence, security and well-being, and then lack of education. And then on the right hand side, I've got information from the Borgen project. They list here climate change as number 1, followed by extreme poverty, followed by inequality and exclusion, and number 4 is conflict, peace, and humanitarian response. In the middle, I have got climate change turning words into action as number 1. Then number 2 is food security and why it matters. Number 4, why should growth be inclusive? And number 5, will the future be gender equal? And this middle one was taken from the World Economic Forum. What I want to highlight here is that in all cases, climate change has been put as the most pressing issue in the world. Therefore, climate change is the biggest problem facing the planet right now. And I can argue that the real challenge that we have with climate change these days is action for climate. Climate change education is therefore unavoidable. Considering that we need to respond to the climate crisis as a matter of urgency, I equate this to what I refer to as confronting a global dysfunction. The big question is, why climate change education? And I can answer this question by referring to an extract from the Brundtland Report, 1982. Current global trends suggest that our behaviors threaten our ability to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It means we are failing in this regard. Climate change should be understood as a social as well as scientific issue characterized by context-specific knowledge, complexity, contestation, and uncertainty. I will go on to show how context, complexity, and contestation are important when we try to do climate change education effectively. I will begin by looking at the fact that climate change issues are context specific. If you remember the past Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, he gave us this quote here, which is a very important quote. He said, "There is no planet B." He said this towards the end of his tenure. It is true. We don't have another planet. We only have one planet. But when we zero on to our own context where we find ourselves, on the right-hand side, we have got a magazine picture which shows the planet Africa, which is overheating. And on the bottom left, on the bottom right, sorry, it shows us a picture of Southern Africa and how the temperatures will increase in Southern Africa, that the temperature will increase between 3 and 6 degrees Celsius by 2100. And the effects of this will be disastrous. For an example, in Southern Africa, beginning from the top right, we have already begun to experience extreme weather conditions. Top right, that is Cyclone Idai, which affected Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, a first ever to affect countries like countries like Zimbabwe and Malawi, which are so far off from the sea. And on the top right, we have got a threat to our biodiversity, and on the bottom right, that is a threat to food security due to crop failure, and bottom left, recurrent drought, which has become a common sight in most of Southern African countries because of climate change. Climate change issues are also complex. I will follow this up with this information which I got from the Guardian. I am going to use this one as an example. The first one here on our right-hand side, doubt over climate science is a product with an industry behind it. And the authors of this article here, they say that with its roots in the tobacco industry, climate science denial talking points can be seen as manufactured doubt. That this is doubt that has been manufactured. It has not been there, but then oil companies have manufactured this doubt and planted it in us. On the right hand side, you've got a picture of a book that was written by Naomi Oreskes and Erin Conway. And in this book, they titled it The Merchants of Doubt. And they highlight how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues ranging from tobacco smoke to global warming. That these are not what the world is saying is actually not true. And my big question is, why has climate change become a highly political issue and not just a scientific one? The next slide shows how oil firms spend millions on climate change lobbying. These are figures for 2019, which shows that BP oil is leading, and these are 5 leading oil companies in the world, and they show how they are sponsoring climate denial. They provide so much money for climate lobbying. This slide here shows the world's biggest oil company, ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil knew of climate change as early as 1981, but it continued to fund deniers for 27 years. They knew the effects of fossil fuels on climate change as early as 1981, and 7 years before it became a public issue. Despite this, they spent millions over the next 20 years promoting climate change denial. I will now talk about contestation. Climate change issues are contested, and scientists do not agree on what constitutes or what causes or what should be done about the climate change crisis. 31,000 scientists say there is no convincing evidence that humans can or will cause global warming. The Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine in the United States of America has been lobbying the United States government to deny climate change as defined by the Kyoto Agreement. I quote, "We urge the United States government to reject the global warming agreement that was written in Kyoto, in Japan, in December 1997. I end this slide with a quote from Roger Higgs. Roger Higgs said carbon dioxide does not cause global warming. He argues that carbon dioxide does not cause global warming. And I quote from him, he said, "We urgently need to expose the carbon dioxide is equal to pollutant as a fallacy being forced upon your children, your grandchildren, your nephews, and your nieces by schools, universities, governments, and mainstream media worldwide, and to denounce it in scrupulously truthful terms that are easily understood by the public, including those youngsters themselves." So Rogers is saying we should reject what schools, colleges, and universities are teaching young people about climate change. One thing that we should also know is that Higgs is paid by oil companies. He works as an oil geologist. On the other hand, we have got scientific consensus that climate change issues are a result of human activities. Leading scientist organizations in the world have claimed that the 10 warmest years in the 140-year record all have occurred since 2005. Over 97% of actively publishing climate scientists agree that human activities are causing climate change. This diagram here is a collection from 5 leading scientist organizations on climate change, including NASA, Hadley Center, Climate Research Unit, National Center for Environmental Information, Berkeley Earth, and Cowtan and Way. The next slide is showing us in pictorial forms scientific consensus on global warming. We are confirming here that 97% of working climate scientists say human activity is a significant contributing factor. On our left-hand side, you have got the yes. This is the percentage number of people who agree that climate change is a result of human activities. And then in the middle, we have got the no's who say climate change is not a result of human activities. And on the right, those are unsure. We concentrate on these two, the one on the left and the one in the middle. You will see that on the left-hand side, the yeses, over 97% of active publishers on climate change and climatologists who are active publishers on the climate change alone agree that climate change is a result of human activities. Only 3% do not agree with that. So the big question is, if climate change is context specific, if it is complex, and if it is uncertain, how do we educate for that kind of a situation? What should climate change education look like? So what is climate change education? Climate change education is an education that aims to address and develop effective responses to climate change. It is education that engages learners in confronting uncertain futures arising from the risks and the human and ecological impacts of climate change. It prepares students for future mitigation and adaptation. And lastly but not least, developing the learner capacity to respond with meaningful action, that is action for the climate. That is what it seems to be missing within our education system these days, is action for the climate with reference to our learners. When it comes to climate change knowledge, the United Nations Environment Programme report of 2014 suggests that while society has confronted and produced a large amounts of knowledge to confront complex global environmental challenges, it is still lacking in responding effectively to these challenges. Knowledge of issues is in itself inadequate. Therefore, a range of action-oriented capabilities are essential, including developing new modes of learning and acknowledging the need for adaptation, mitigation, including transformative learning. In this case, transformative learning is presented as a generic process that is key to shaping the possible, probable, and preferred futures arising from the consequences of climate change. Climate change education is education for social transformation. Climate education involves the emergence of new forms of human activities that sustain viable livelihoods. Besides focusing on knowledge and socialization, climate change education focuses on the emancipation of students from predetermined ways of thinking and being and the responsibility that follows with it. Climate change education takes the form of transformative learning. Climate change education demands that dominant pedagogies and forms of learning should enable students and staff to deal with accelerating change, increasing complexity, contested knowledge claims, and inevitable uncertainty, to disrupt unsustainable practices and create new and more sustainable ways of thinking and being. We need transformative education for this to happen. I will now use three quotes to conclude. The first quote is from Alvin Toffler, who said, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." I will focus on learning, unlearning, and relearning. Climate change education promises learning for climate action, unlearning those practices that are unsustainable, which society has taught us, and relearning sustainable practices that society had abandoned. This is learning for a sustainable future. The second quote comes from Charles Darwin when he was talking about the survival of species, and he says, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." What he was saying here is that for a species to survive, it needs to respond to change. So for us to survive as a human species, we have to respond to the current changes that are taking place. And the significance of education here is such that education should respond to the current change by enabling an environment which develops in learners critical thinking skills, collaboration, creativity, communication. In other words, we are talking here about the sustainability competencies that learners need in order to confront the 21st century. So, what can we promise with climate change education? The third quote I will use is from Albert Einstein, who said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. The same thinking we used when we created this problem is the problem." And I would like to call this business as usual. If we use the same thinking, we are in a business as usual mode. What we need is a, to disrupt business as usual so we have business as unusual. So, what we promise with climate change education is education for a new way of thinking and acting, which will take us out of the mess that we find ourselves in right now. So, climate change education is education for social transformation. And for me, this is quality education. So, current education is what I can refer to as business as usual, and we would like to change this so that we get into what climate education is advocating for, which is business as unusual. I thank you.